There is a clock face on the tower of St. Hedwig's Church in the old quarter of Brzeg, in what was once Silesia, that most visitors walk past without stopping. The tower itself is unremarkable by the standards of Central European ecclesiastical architecture, stone, weathered, built to last. But the clock face is wrong. Not broken, not deteriorated, wrong in a way that takes a moment to register. The numerals run not to 12 but to 13. The hour hand, if you watch it long enough, completes its rotation not in the 12 divisions the modern world considers self-evident, but in 13 equal segments, each representing a unit of time that no living person was taught to name. The clock still runs. It has run for centuries, and it is not alone. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who is paying attention. What the church records at Brzeg show, and what the records at dozens of other sites across Central Europe, the British Isles and the Iberian Peninsula confirm, is that 13-hour timekeeping was not an aberration, it was a standard. Clock towers built between the 12th and early 19th centuries across a geographic area spanning thousands of miles show consistent evidence of a 13-division system that was later modified, in most cases replaced entirely, during a window of approximately 30 years between 1830 and 1860. The mechanism was the same across dozens of sites. The replacement was the same across dozens of sites. The silence that followed was the same. The official explanation, where one is offered at all, is that 13-hour clocks were local eccentricities, regional experiments that failed to gain traction, curiosities of pre-industrial timekeeping that were naturally superseded by the rationalization of the standard 12-hour system as rail travel and telegraphy required synchronized time across long distances. This is the explanation that appears in architectural surveys, in horological journals, in the footnotes of municipal histories that mention the old clock faces briefly before moving on. What those footnotes do not explain is why the replacement happened so fast. Railroads did not synchronize British timekeeping until 1847. The telegraph was not yet a continental-scale network. The pressure to adopt a universal clock had not yet materialized in most of the regions where the 13-hour faces were being replaced. The replacements began in documented cases before the justification for them existed. To understand what the record actually shows, you need to understand what a 13-hour clock face means architecturally. It is not simply a different numbering. A clock face divided into 13 segments requires a different gear ratio in the escapement mechanism. It runs at a different speed. The hour it marks is not the same length as a modern hour. The 13-hour day, if that is what these clocks once measured, divided the period of daylight, or the full rotation of the Earth, into 13 units rather than 12 twice over. The implications of that division reach into every aspect of how a society organized labor, worship, commerce, and rest. The church at Brzeg was built in a period when the institution that commissioned it held authority over time itself. The canonical hours, the sequence of prayers that structured the medieval day, were not derived from astronomical observation. They were prescribed. And they were prescribed in a system that in many documented regions counted not in 12s but in 13s. The prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline that survive in Catholic liturgical practice are remnants of a fuller sequence. The documents from several German and Polish monasteries, dating between the 12th and 15th centuries, show a prayer schedule with an additional canonical hour that later manuscripts simply omit without explanation. The monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland maintains one of the best preserved medieval archives in Europe. Among its holdings are administrative records from the 13th century that include references to a horologium with a tertiodecima divisio, a 13th division. The record is brief. It appears in a ledger of maintenance expenses and refers to a repair carried out on the tower instrument. It does not explain what a 13th division was because, at the time the ledger was written, no explanation was needed. The reader would have known. That reader is gone. The knowledge they carried is gone. What remains is the ledger entry and the clock face at Brzeg. and the 73 other tower clocks across Europe that horological researchers have now documented as showing evidence of modification, faces refaced, gear trains replaced, numerals recut, during that same 30-year window in the 19th century. The question the record raises is not whether these clocks existed. They are physically present. Several are still running. The question is what happened in those 3 decades that made their replacement not just desirable but apparently urgent. Urgent enough that institutions which had maintained these instruments for 4 and 5 centuries moved to replace them within a single generation. Urgent enough that in at least 12 documented cases, the original clock mechanisms were not preserved, not relocated, not donated to collectors or museums, but destroyed, melted down or broken apart on site. In Erfurt, in the German state of Thuringia, the tower of the Church of St. Severus underwent a documented restoration between 1841 and 1844. The restoration records, held in the Thuringian State Archive, include a line item for the removal and disposal of the existing uhrwerk, the clockwork. The replacement mechanism is described as a modern 12-hour movement. The original is described only as the alte Einrichtung. The old arrangement, no dimensions, no maker's mark, no description of what made it old enough to warrant that designation, or different enough to require destruction rather than storage. The alte Einrichtung at St. Severus was gone by the spring of 1844. What it measured and how long it had been measuring it, the record does not say. The archive at Erfurt is not unique in what it omits, it is representative. Across the documented cases of clock replacement in this period, the pattern of description is consistent in a way that itself becomes evidence. The new mechanisms are catalogued with precision, maker, movement type, number of bells, maintenance schedule, cost. The old mechanisms are described in the same breath as problems to be solved. Worn, outdated, incompatible with modern requirements. The language is administrative, bloodless, and in every case carefully avoids specifying what the old mechanism actually did differently. You do not need to describe what you are destroying if the people reading the record already know not to ask. The horologist Johann Heinrich Seyffert, working in Leipzig in the 1850s, kept a private journal that was donated to the Saxon State Library in 1912 by his granddaughter. The journal spans 30 years of professional work and contains detailed notes on dozens of clock installations and restorations across Saxony and the neighbouring states. Among those notes, written in the autumn of 1848, is an entry describing a commission he declined. A church council in a town he identifies only as a village east of Chemnitz had hired him to remove an existing tower movement and replace it with a standard 12-hour mechanism. When Seyffert examined the existing instrument, he found it in excellent working condition. His notes describe a gear train of unusual configuration. He uses the phrase mir unbekannte Teilung, a division unknown to me, and a face marked with numerals he does not reproduce in the journal but describes as running past the expected terminus. He declined the commission. His note gives the reason as discomfort with destroying functional work of evident craftsmanship. A colleague completed the job the following spring. Seyffert records this in a single sentence and does not return to the subject. The village east of Chemnitz does not appear by name. The clock he described is gone, but the journal entry is dated, signed, and held in a public archive. The commission happened. The instrument he described existed. The destruction was completed by someone willing to do what Seyffert was not. What those replacement programs share, across Germany, Poland, the Habsburg territories, England, and the Iberian Peninsula, is institutional coordination without any surviving institutional record of that coordination. There is no papal encyclical ordering the replacement of non-standard clock faces. There is no decree from a Protestant synod standardizing tower timekeeping. There is no royal commission, no engineering society circular, no published rationale from any body with authority over church property directing that 13 division movements be removed. The replacements happened consistently across confessional lines, across political borders, across languages, and the paper trail that would normally accompany any coordinated institutional program simply does not exist. What does exist is the physical record of who carried out the work. In England, the period between 1835 and 1855 saw a surge of church restorations funded partly by the Ecclesiastical Commission, established by Parliament in 1836. The Commission's records, held at Lambeth Palace Library, document expenditures on hundreds of church properties. Among those records, a subset of entries covers tower clock work described as modernisation of the horology. The invoices attached to these entries show payments to a small number of clockmaking firms concentrated in London and Birmingham. The same firms appear across dozens of parishes in counties with no geographic connection to one another. One of those firms was Dent and Company of the Strand, later responsible for the movement in the Elizabeth Tower at Westminster. Edward John Dent, who ran the firm during this period, left business correspondence that survives in fragmentary form at the Guildhall Library. The correspondence addresses technical matters, escapement specifications, bell weights, installation schedules. It does not address the question of why the movements being replaced were being replaced. In one letter dated 1843, Dent writes to a parish clerk that the old face will be taken away by the men and need not concern you further. The phrase is practical. It is also precise in a way that reads differently once you know what the old faces sometimes showed. Taken away. Not described, not preserved, taken away. If this investigation has your attention, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more to uncover. Your support makes it possible to bring these buried histories to the surface. The question of what a 13-hour day actually measured requires a detour through what survives of pre-modern astronomical practice, because the answer is not obvious, and the obvious answer is wrong. A 13-hour clock does not simply divide the day into 13 units of roughly 1 hour and 50 minutes each. The surviving examples, the ones that can still be observed, suggest a more specific organization. The 13 divisions appear to correspond to a system in which the period between sunrise and sunset, regardless of season, was divided into a fixed number of canonical intervals, with the 13th hour serving a function closer to what modern practice would call a transitional or liminal period. Not quite day, not quite night. The threshold hour. Several surviving liturgical documents from Benedictine houses in Bavaria and Austria contain references to the hora tridecima in a context that distinguishes it from the preceding 12. It is described as the hour of transition, the hour of accounting, the hour in which the work of the day was assessed before the silence of the night began. This is not a minor administrative distinction. It suggests a conception of time organized not around equal mechanical division, but around the quality of the period being marked. The 13th hour was different in kind from the others, not just in sequence. That conception of time is irreconcilable with the industrial world that emerged in the 1840s and 1850s. Factory labor requires equal hours. Railway schedules require equal hours. A system in which the 13th hour operates by different rules, in which time has a quality as well as a quantity, cannot coexist with a grid of production that demands perfect interchangeability of every unit. The 13-hour clock did not fail to modernize. It was incompatible with what modernization required, and so it was removed. But removed by whom and on whose authority remains the question the archive refuses to answer directly. The clockmakers who did the work left invoices. The church councils who commissioned the work left minutes. The mechanisms that were removed left nothing, because in case after documented case, leaving nothing was the explicit outcome. In Wrocław, formerly Breslau, the tower of St. Elizabeth's Church underwent restoration in 1851. The Restoration Committee minutes preserved in the Wrocław City Archive record the decision to replace the existing tower movement in a single line. The following line records the appointment of a local clockmaker to carry out the work. There is no discussion, no dissent recorded, no description of what is being replaced or why the decision was unanimous. The committee moved from one item of business to the next as though the matter required no deliberation, because the deliberation had already happened somewhere the minutes do not record. The clockmaker's name in those Wrocław minutes is Franz Holman. His workshop records do not survive. What survives is the invoice he submitted upon completion, which lists materials, labour, and a final line for the disposal of the existing mechanism. The disposal is priced separately. It cost more than the installation of the new movement. Disposing of what was already there, in 1851 in Wrocław, cost more than building what replaced it. The record does not say what made it so expensive to make the old clock disappear.